Good evening, everyone. We're continuing on our adventure through Swami Kriyananda Lightbearer. If you're having half as much fun doing this as I am, then I think you're having a great time. It's just been just really wonderful to revisit both the book and, of course, the life experience. Anyway, the older one gets on the spiritual path, the more one realizes how young one used to be and how nice it is to be more, I guess is the actual word. There's nothing else to say. So let's start with the prayer and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to lift our hearts and minds in receptivity to your ever-flowing love and light. Fill us with your vibrations that we may see the world as you see it, a place of divine opportunity to love and to share and to give. Help us to help others as you have so selflessly guided us. We are your children. Bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. In preparation for these classes, year by year, I reread the book, which even though I wrote it, it's already been a couple of years and details of it are gone. In fact, as soon as it was finished, it was sort of gone because it just passes through. And I've remarked that a book that you publish is like raising a child. I've never raised a child. I have published books, but it's like you remember that you had something to do with it. But once that child becomes an adult and goes to medical school and becomes the, renowned surgeon, it's kind of hard to know what your part in that was because it just has its own life, its own friends, its own reality. So even though I can remember working on this book and remember making decisions and I see my own notes, nonetheless, it's like the power of Swami's life had its own trajectory. And then I still have my files. I cleaned out my files a lot after I finished writing, but I still have a lot of paper. And, not every word that's in the files is in the book. And it was interesting to me because 1978, our master plan was actually approved by Nevada County, and I scarcely even mentioned that. In 1975, we started that campaign to get the incompetent director fired. She was fired in August of 1977. And then a year later, our master plan, finally got over the hurdle that she herself had represented. And it was an important thing that happened, but from the point of view of Swami's life, it wasn't, it was an incidental event. And so I remembered when I was writing all of this, there would be literally, just hundreds of pages of notes, depending on what the year was, just piled up in this cottage where I was living. And I had it all organized in various ways. But just certain things were part of the story. And there were whole other books. My story was how Swami created Ananda, not the story of Ananda per se, because that was a whole nother drama, which I've said at other times. I never lived in the community in Nevada County. I lived at the monastery, and then later where it became Swami's enclave. Even after the monastic order was over, there were several of us who still lived over there. And I lived at the retreat, but the whole property that was the community, it was just never my reality. My reality was through Swami. So it was all very selective. In other words, there are volumes and volumes more from so many different directions. So I'm also working now, and I sort of stumbled into this, which is sharing all these pictures from all these years. And of course, as the years progress, we have more and more pictures. So we have quite a few tonight. And we'll just start from the beginning and just give you the picture, and I'll use the pictures to tell you the stories. So let's get it set up and started. Okay. In 1977, the last year, Swamiji had been in seclusion. He came back in October. He left in April and came back in October. When he came back in October, he said very strongly, Divine Mother wants me to use my energy to reach out to the world. It's like the secluded years of being at Ananda village. The publication of The Path changed everything. So we started right in with Master's birthday, January 5th. Instead of celebrating it at Ananda village, we celebrated it in San Francisco. So this is a rented hall, probably in the Unitarian Church. You can see Swami up there speaking, and there's a painting behind him of the Himalayas. You'll see it clearly in another moment. Next picture. This is the same event. Swamiji had Jyotish and I, of course that's me on the left, had Jyotish and I sit with him, and we took questions about discipleship. And it was a pretty significant moment in my life. I'd never sat on the dais with Swami before, never shared a program with him. Jyotish had done it much more than I, but it was really new for me. And it was after that Swami gave one of his advice to me about how to be a public speaker. He said, Asha, I think you would be better if, oh, never mind, you'll be better when you've done it more. He never really instructed me very deeply, but I've always just really appreciated that. There's only so much you can say. After you have more experience, you'll know more what to do. So moving to the next. This may be the same. No, this isn't the same setting. Now Swamiji is on the road with his Joy Tour. I'm not exactly sure when he left on this Joy Tour, but it was somewhere in the late spring, I think. And those little costumes, the girls had these blue dresses and the boys had little tunic tops. There were lots of different opinions about these dresses. They had this ribbon trim around it, and the joy symbol was embroidered on it. So the whole time they traveled, there were 12 people traveling with Swamiji. He, as he put it, he said, having all the community representatives there showed people more graphically than any words could what Ananda was. The variety of individuals, the way they work together, the way they talk to people. It's Maitri, Shivani, and Kalyani, and then in the back is Ram and Lakshman Simpson and Durga. That was part of the singing group. Next picture. Swamiji, this was how they would set up for him. Sometimes he wears orange robe, sometimes he wears suit. I'm not really quite sure what the context was, one way or another, how he would be dressed. But this is what they would set up whenever they had a program. Next picture. I actually showed this picture earlier, in an earlier year, but it was misplaced. If there was a piano in the hall where the program was happening, Swami would play his piano sonata. And piano sonata, we're actually going to listen to it at the end of this program. We're going to listen to Swamiji himself playing the piece of music. It was called The Divine Romance. He wrote it for his mother in the year 1975. He wrote it for her birthday. It's 11 minutes, 12 minutes long. It's in 3 movements. Subsequently, he wrote words for the first movement, and it became God's Call Within, which is a very well-known song within Ananda. And mostly people think of that is what they think of when they think of the Divine Romance. From the beginning, those words were not there at the beginning. The beginning, the last few bars of the last movement had some vocal. So it could well be that Kalyani would stand next to him and then sing the last part, and Swami would perform the piano sonata. So you can see this was on tour. This is like on the road show. The Gandharva sings, Swami sits down at the piano and plays his piece, he talks. They showed slides of Ananda. It was really quite a program. Moving on. This is just another venue. There's other people there like Parvati who didn't travel with Swami, so I'm not sure exactly where or when, but you again get the feeling of what they were doing. Next picture. This is Swami arriving in Texas. This is Savitri, and she lived in a community called Peaceable Kingdom there in Texas. She'd moved from Memphis, Tennessee to Texas, and she knew about Swamiji, and she invited him to come and speak at their community. So here she is greeting him. Next picture. They're there at the Peaceable Kingdom is what it was called. Swami putting on his program outside for the residents of that community. Next picture. This is in Austin, Texas. This is the tour group. Santosh is on the left, Santosh O'Hara, Prahlad, Lakshman Simpson, Durga, Ram, Vidura, and a man named Narada. Santosh and Prahlad they didn't always travel with Swami. They were the advanced team. And then there's the next picture, the same group. And now Savitri's kneeling in the front, and next to her is Krishnadas. Krishnadas met Swamiji on this tour and became completely enamored of Ananda and never looked back. The couple in the center were the hosts in Austin. Their names escape me at the moment. Shivani, Maitri, Durga, Kalyani, Ram, you can see the various others. Next picture. They would do, the Joy Tour would do all-day seminars, and they would cook meals. So in addition to everything else they were doing, they would, if there was a kitchen and it was available, they would cook a whole meal, sometimes 2 meals, for all the seminar registrants. So it was a whole immersion experience. And Swami was a very good cook, and he would supervise the cooking. It was mostly done by Maitri, I think. Next picture. I think that was one of her responsibilities, Maitri and Durga, with Swami sort of trying to sort out what they're going to do for lunch that day. Okay, and this is Swami just singing at one of the venues. This photograph is flipped. You see he's playing the guitar backwards, but this photograph got flipped so long ago that it just remains this way, and I didn't know how to flip it back over. Okay, next picture. This was Swamiji in New York City. The woman next to him is Hilda Charlton. Hilda Charlton was an extremely well-known teacher at that time. She'd had a direct connection to Master, I believe, although she wasn't formally his disciple. This was at St. John the Divine Church. I met Swami in New York City, so I may have been in the room at this point, or maybe it was a different point in the tour, I'm not sure. There were like 700 people for her weekly satsangs. And at the end of the satsang, they would all chant Om together. And I flew to New York by myself, I think, and then rendezvoused with Swami in the group, or at least with Swami at Hilda's place. And I'd never been with 700 people who would chant Om. Ananda was so much smaller than that. And the extraordinary energy that was generated with Swami and Hilda and all those people in the room. Hilda Charlton scarcely ever left her apartment except to do her satsangs. But early the next morning, I must have been staying in the same apartment as Swamiji, because early the next morning, Hilda comes knocking at the door with several of her entourage. And she had been so taken by Swami that she really literally came in and wanted to touch his feet. She just got up as soon as it was a decent hour. She came over to express her admiration for him. Swami was relatively unknown, and Hilda was extremely well known. So it was really an unexpected, from many people's point of view, act of respect on her part to do that. Anyway, lovely. It was a lovely experience. And it was during that same trip to New York, I had a number of very important, serious conversations with Swami in the taxi cab. It was then when we had a discussion, because these were big issues at that time, as to what was Swami's role and what was Master's role. Because my whole spiritual life was defined by Swami, but the Guru was Master, and how was I supposed to relate to that? I was perfectly willing to relate to Master, but even everything I understood about Master came through Swami. And my common sense told me that whatever relationship I had to Master was through Swami, but it was a big subject of conversation in all of Ananda at that point. And so it was in that context that Swami said to me, I always thought I could do, well, first he said, there are plenty of gurus. What the world needs now is example of what it means to be a disciple. And then he said what he would often say, well, I'm not a guru because I'm not self-realized. Later he actually modified the way he said that a little bit. But that's what he said at that point. I said, Swamiji, a relationship like a guru and a disciple is probably not going to be formed all of a sudden when the guru becomes an avatar, when he becomes a siddhi, self-realized. I said, it's probably going to form a long time before that. Look at St. Francis and St. Clare and Teresa of Avila. They all had those who were deeply devoted to them, whose entire spiritual life was defined, and they were a family moving forward. So it seems to me that that relationship would start much earlier. Swami said, of course, what else was he going to say? He also said that Master said to him, Swami said that Master told him that he wouldn't only be a teacher, but that he would bear spiritual responsibility for people. And then he said, but I always thought I could do more good for people as a simple, unaffected friend than in any other role. That was how he put it. And for me, that was a very extraordinarily important conversation, which took place in the taxicab, which may have taken place exactly when this picture was here. I think it was also in that, yes, it was in that context also, because there was a huge amount of adoration around Hilda. And she deserved it. She was a very powerful spiritual person. But there was a huge, much more of a kerfuffle always going on around her than there ever was around Swami. And I believe it was in that context, and seeing 700 people there. And our joy tours, I have to add, sometimes our crew would outnumber the audience. Sometimes there were big crowds, sometimes not. But I said to Swamiji, if you let us walk around holding a white umbrella over your head, and that's sort of like the traditional, that's how the gurus, you keep the sun off their head. Well, one person's job is just to keep the white umbrella over his head. If you let us walk around with a white umbrella over your head, I said, then we could really get the show on the road. I mean, if we just played the game a lot more, people would be impressed. And that was actually when he said, I always thought I could do more as a simple, unaffected friend. But it was interesting to me the way he phrased that, which is I could just be more helpful. It wasn't like this is all that I should do. This was a choice. I made this choice for a good reason. Moving on, let's go to the next picture. On that tour, they went to Sunrise Ranch. Unfortunately, I can't quite remember the name. Norman Paulson's ranch in Santa Barbara, where he had a community. This is Norman Paulson, Swamiji's guru, a direct disciple of Master. They were monks together at Mount Washington. You see Ram in the corner enjoying the show. Let's see the next picture. And the next picture, this is Bernard, Norman Paulson, and Swami Kriyananda, the three. When Swami arrived at Mount Washington in 1948, 22 years old, Norman and Bernard were always there. Bernard was the one whom Master directed to instruct Swami and to teach him the basic teachings. And Norman was just a deeply devoted soul, and he and Swami became very good friends. So this is 1978. 1948 is when these men first met. Both Bernard and Norman, of their own will, left Mount Washington after Master passed. And Swami, of course, was expelled later. But you can see, it's quite a picture. Master spoke of Norman. He was my giant, Master said, speaking of the time when Master was William the Conqueror, and he had an army, and he said, Norman was my giant, and he fought hard for me. So you see, and here he is again, he's just such a big man. He ran this community which has the word sun in it. I wish I could remember. Some of their people came to visit us not too long ago. It's very, very nice. Okay, next, on to the next. This is Swami Kriyananda's house when this was all the house there was. This is now just the living room of Crystal Hermitage, and all the partitions have been taken down. You can see the halfway partition on the left. Behind that is Swami's office. You can see the loft on the right. That was Swami's bedroom. There was a bathroom underneath there. And in the upper level, where you see those books, behind that, that's where the kitchen is. And we would stand there and wash dishes, and Swami would kind of lean against the counter sometimes and talk to it. And that was the front door. When you open that door, rain and snow, there you are. And the furniture here is the cashmere furniture that Swami bought. And all that furniture is still in the house, the carved furniture there. So let's go to the next picture. This is just another view with the piano in the corner. And you can see the furniture a little bit more with I don't know why we didn't have the embroidered cushions. Maybe we hadn't sewn it up yet, but those were cushions that we made for the chairs instead. Next picture. This is just a meeting taking place there. Why don't you take the next one, because it's more attractive of the same picture. This is just Swamiji and all of us sitting together talking about something or another. This was exceedingly common that Swami would invite us all over, and we would sit there. The young boy is Kalyani's son, Prem, and Prem has stayed with Ananda through his whole life. He lives with his wife in Sacramento. Now, I'm in the far, as you face it, the far right corner in the back. And Nirmala's in front of me, people that you know. Jyotish and Devi, of course. Okay, next picture. This, just pause, go back for a second. This is quintessential life with Swami during all those years. Whether there was a room full of people or just a few of us, but this is like that piece of carpet in that spot. That was my life with Swami for many years, right there. Moving to the next. I don't know what occasion this was. At first I was going to say it was the monastics, but there are people there who aren't monastics, so I don't know what it was. It was some kind of a gathering, and for some reason we decided to take a picture. So this is, once again, this is the whole community just sort of filling in his room. I have no sense of context here. Next picture. This is Peter Caddy, who is the founder of Findhorn. And Peter came to visit Swamiji and gave a program. This is Swami Kriyananda in the winter. Swami had just a few clothes, and he just wore them off, and that sweater was, that was his sweater in the winter, and his long hair. And Peter came to visit, and we had been having trouble. That was when our neighbors kept knocking down our mailbox, somehow when Peter was visiting us. And Peter and Swami said to each other, but Peter said, if they're not persecuting you, you're not doing enough good. You need to work harder. If you're doing enough good, of course they'll persecute you. And Swami and he just laughed together at the very idea. Move to the next picture. It's just Peter again making us all laugh. He was a very charming man. He and his wife and another woman, the three of them together were responsible for founding Findhorn community in Scotland. Next picture. Now we have a picture of a few weddings that took place. This was a Ananda wedding. Swami sitting on the floor, the couple sitting on the floor. We had a big fire pit in the middle. This was a different wedding ceremony. It was the one that Master had written, and it involved walking around the fire 7 times. When Swami himself got married in 1985, he wrote a new wedding ceremony. This is Mary Kretzmann and Tim Kretzmann. Tim Kretzmann died in 2012, but they came young and they raised 3 children in the community. Next picture. This is Hriman and Padma McGilloway. This was a wedding outside. You can see, I think, her parents are sitting behind Hriman. Once again, this is a wok that we would take out of the retreat kitchen and cover with tinfoil and set it on bricks. We were exuberantly happy, but not very formal. Okay, next picture. This is Hriman and Padma again, and Swamiji. You can see that Swamiji is not even wearing a shirt. He's just wearing a dhoti and a chadar, and he was officiating at the wedding, but that was perfectly appropriate attire for an Indian yogi, so he was dressed accordingly. The girl is Molly. Fremont had a daughter, Molly, when he married Padma, so she was about 8 or 9. She was the flower girl. Okay, next. It was actually a double wedding, and the woman in the center, that's Paula. And I know in different classes I've talked a lot about Paula's death and how inspiring it was. Paula was married twice. This was her first wedding, and it was a double wedding. Swami tried these multiple weddings for a little while, but they were a real dud. No one really liked them at all. And Paula and Arjuna are brother and sister. So Arjuna and Shivani were there as the best people when Paula got married there. So there's one more. The next picture is a closer picture of Paula's spirit thanking Swamiji after the wedding. You can sort of see what a sweetheart she was. Next picture. This was, I believe, the retreat staff. At Spiritual Renewal Week, we just sort of have different groups get in front of the camera. Savitri's right next to Swami, Kirtani's on the other side. Sahadev is standing in the back. Purushottama's right behind Swami. I don't think any of the others are anybody that you would know. So, next picture. This was just a summer class with outdoor in the Temple of Trees. You can see the crowds are getting bigger. In the original pictures, when I started in 71 and 72, there was 15 people there. And now you can see the crowds are getting bigger. And we always had that statue, that Sacred Heart statue of Jesus that, I don't know where it came from, but it was part of, until I think the temple collapsed. I don't know if it survived the collapse of the temple or not, but that statue was always around. I never much related to it. Sometimes people who knew about those things would give it great significance, but I'm not sure any of us actually really knew where it came from. We liked it. It was a beautiful statue, but it wasn't until in the early 80s when Swami wrote the oratorio that we really began to relate to Jesus differently. So this is by now the Gandharvas. Swami doesn't pull out his guitar and sing quite as much because he wants the Gandharvas to be the singers. So next picture. This is just something from that year. I don't know what Swami was reading. And then let's go to the last one in this set, which was Swami's birthday of that year. And we were a little better then when we had the high school girls dancing around Swami. That is actually Jaya's daughter in the little pink semi-sari. She was throwing rose petals on Swamiji. The woman with all the black hair sitting at Swami's knee is Leela Devi. Dave Warner, Devarshi is behind her. Vijay's standing up. I don't think there's anyone else that you know in that picture. This was the birthday meadow. We would just move everything out and have this celebration. So while we're enjoying this picture, which was just as happy as it looks, it was a very, very happy year. Swami had returned from his first joy tour, and it was really a big, expansive time for us. And I'm going to have a recording here that's not the best recording, but it's Swami himself singing one of his own songs, which is Little Kathy. So let's enjoy the music while we look at the picture.
And here's another children's song, and you can sing the refrain with me on this one. This is another melody that came to me as I woke up in the morning. Several have come that way. It's kind of a nice way to wake up. Little Kathy went dancing, went dancing, went dancing. Little Kathy went dancing one day. She danced out in the garden, the garden, the garden. She danced out in the garden. Her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. small robin, small robin, there she saw a small robin, it sat in a tree. Little friend, come and join me, come join me, come join me. Little friend, come and join me, come dancing with me. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. I'm afraid I'd look silly, look silly, look silly. I'm afraid I'd look silly, the robin said then. For I'm timid and tiny and tiny and tiny. For I'm timid and tiny, birds can't dance like men. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. But you've wings you can fly with, can fly with, can fly with. But you've wings you can fly with, why strut like a man? Everyone can do something, do something, do something. Everyone can do something, it's part of life's plan. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. Let's go call all our neighbors, our neighbors, our neighbors. Let's go call all our neighbors, the large and the small. All the world should be dancing, be dancing, be dancing. All the world should be dancing, for God made us all. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. La 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 lee, oh la 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 lay. Little Kathy went dancing, her heart was so gay. Thank you. Thank you.
So, let's see. Let me just think where I want to be with all of this. So, if you could darken the screen. Thank you. I don't like to have to just look at my own face. The real story of 1978 was Swamiji did two, not quite back to back, but he did two joy tours in that year. Joy tours is what, these things, how they begin to get a word. He decided the theme would be the practice of joy, and he just set out to go from California to New York City and back again. He did it in the spring. He came home and spent the summer at Ananda, and then at the end of September, he set out again for another 8 weeks. He did the whole tour again and went up. That time he went up into Canada. I was looking in my files, and I found like these little brochures that we did for this. Somehow we were super into these things that opened up. This is how publicity was done. It was all just pieces of paper, and we printed up thousands of these and had all these mailing parties, and just incredible. And we did this one also. I'm not quite sure, it's not clear to me why we had all these different ones, but here was the same thing in different colors that we were printing up. And when they went the second time, I think it was simpler. I organized the first tour, and Shivani traveled with Swami. And then the second tour, Shivani didn't travel with Swami, and she stayed home. And on the back here, this is the list. There's 17 cities here. 8-week tour, 17 cities, starting from Ananda Village, going down through Texas, Colorado, and up, and then all the way up to Montreal, and then all the way back across the country. It was quite a tour. And in both times he traveled with 12 people, a large group of people in the motorhome. He lived in the motorhome. Everybody else would stay with devotees. So it was quite a journey. When Swami set out on the first tour in the spring, now we have published the path. Swami's whole stature as a disciple has completely shifted at this point. And you may remember I talked about how there was a certain point when Dayamata summoned Swami to come and meet with her at Mount Washington, and he had me tell her that it was not convenient. And that was a big moment in Ananda history. And then now he's published this book about Master, and SRF, as a response, has now put out what they called a publisher's note. And I think it was in the book Divine Romance, and I don't know whether they still publish it or not, but they started putting this note into their publications that warned people. It was a warning about false teachers. That's how we always called it, the warning against false teachers. And I'm pretty sure that was the words that was in it. And it talked about how certain individuals are borrowing the Guru's name and using it for their own purposes. And of course it was written, as Swami pointed out, as if this was an epidemic, that there were just dozens and dozens of people borrowing the Guru's name, whereas in fact there was one, and it was entirely directed at Swami Kriyananda. So his stepping forward and asserting his discipleship by publishing the path caused SRF to feel that they had to warn people that this person was masquerading as a disciple, but that you really needed to look for the SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship imprint on every piece of material, and if you didn't see it, then you couldn't trust it. So when Swami he starts his tour, he goes right down into Southern California. And he said it was a very challenging atmosphere. Even the person that we had hired to help us publicize the tour had been warned by people that she shouldn't really put energy behind a person who was unworthy to be promoted. So it was a little tense. And Swami got lots of challenging questions. And as he wrote about it, as he said when he wrote to us later, he said, I'm being forced to say more than I wanted to, perhaps more than I should. But he had this very simple and interesting way to put it. He said, if I don't speak, he said, my reason for keeping silence is a desire to be gracious, to not fan the flames of controversy. But my silence is interpreted as if I have some guilty secrets I have to keep. That why can't I just answer directly what's being asked? So Swami just took the bait, so to speak, and he just spoke his mind. He spoke it as fairly as he could, but he spoke it frankly, and he started talking about things that became themes for the next 25 years, which is the editing of the books. He used as an example the Whispers from Eternity book. At that time, the original version of that book was not available. The only thing that was available was this highly edited version, which really bore no resemblance to the original book. And Swami just started talking about what he'd seen. He had to explain why he felt that he had a right to be a disciple and present himself as such. Over the years and much later, and in the book I tried to be loyal to the information as I learned it, but in this context I'm going to just skip a little bit. One of the reasons Swami was so exceedingly reluctant to assert any spiritual authority was that he said he felt that he was walking an exceedingly dangerous line. He had been, not by his own volition, but nonetheless he had been expelled from his guru's organization. He had been repudiated by all his fellow disciples, virtually without exception. and certainly all of those who were regarded as the heirs to Master's lineage and were speaking with the authority, with that authority behind them. And they were unrelenting in their criticism. It wasn't as if, oh, okay, we'll just, it was a misunderstanding. You go your way, we'll go ours. We'll exchange Christmas cards, we'll still be friends. No, it was warning against false teachers. People are borrowing the guru's name and using it for their own aggrandizement, whatever it was. So, and Swamiji had no peers and no superiors with whom he could confer, because all of those who were his peers or his superiors had repudiated him and denied his right to be a disciple. And he couldn't accept that. He couldn't accept that he was going to give up his discipleship. So he had no peers or superiors. So he just had to trust what he felt inwardly. And as I spoke a couple of sessions ago, when Swami was writing to a young man who had challenged him, Swami said, I've been forced to do something that I warn others against, which is becoming so isolated and having to follow your own guidance without anyone to confirm or correct you. So Swamiji also felt that he would do everything he could to prevent the cultivation of a following. And so that in every way he would repudiate his right to that. And therefore, if it came to him, then he would know it had been sent by God and it had not been drawn by any action on his own. So that's why his conversation, even almost to the end of his life, but not quite to the end, why he was always so hesitant to claim a spiritual position. In 1998, which is actually 20 years from when we're talking now, is when he finally began to speak more frankly. But that was like 12 years before he died, 15 years before he died. But for all the years before that, he would always repudiate and defer and reject, so that whatever came to him was sent by God and not attracted by Swami. So, but when Swami came back from the first tour, which is he was back by his birthday, and then he didn't leave again till September, he actually felt that it was time to make a statement. And I'm just showing you because, these were, like we published this little tiny pamphlet, which says Ananda Cooperative Village and Self-Realization Fellowship. You can see we didn't spend a lot on the graphics or the printing. And it was just this one's my only copy, so it's all marked up, but this is it's this long with the back. That's all there is. It was like a page and a half. But he really spoke about Ananda Cooperative Village and Self-Realization Fellowship. For him to publish something like this, and then when they went on tour, it would be out on the free literature table. When anybody asked us, we could mail, here's our statement. And Swami's essential point was, if people feel inspiration, they'll go where they feel inspiration. And he also spoke, because this was his essential point of view, that disciples want to serve. And giving disciples an opportunity to serve. He was always trying to find a way to define Ananda in such a way that it was not competitive with SRF. SRFs, if you were a brahmachari or a brahmacharini, if you were a monk or a nun living in the ashram, you were allowed to have a leadership position. At Ananda, it was for householders, it was for single people, and responsibility was extremely dispersed. So an individual who wanted to be a disciple of Master and to serve could find countless ways at Ananda to really contribute. And Swami emphasized that as one of the differences, just lifestyle differences. But it was a huge shift of his energy when he was willing to, just make it known, make the relationship known. So when Swami came back for the summer, he started doing a lot of recording. He got recording equipment, and when they'd been on tour, everybody wanted recordings of the music, and we didn't have very many or any. So Swami got recording equipment and started recording, and he also did a great many classes because he'd been away for so many months. He felt he needed to fill in the energy. So with recordings and recording concerts and giving classes, we were all extremely involved and busy with him. But in August, and what was also going on is we were desperately struggling, trying to make up all the money that we needed to rebuild the community after the fire. We were still way far back from where we'd been. And we got the master plan approved. We got permission to rebuild all the houses that had burned, but we didn't have the money to do it. And again, in fact, I think I said it was last in 1977, but it was really in 78 when people went out to the rice harvest and they went out tree planting, just doing our very best to try to get money so we could put the community back together. We were everybody who wanted to was living there in one way or another, but still it had just been such an enormous setback. And Swamiji's efforts, Swamiji's response to how to deal with this great financial need had been to finish writing and publish The Path, which, of course brought in something, but was not a huge windfall. And then he took 12 people and he went traveling around the country. It was like just the opposite of what most people would do, which would be to hunker down and try to put my house in order. Swami felt that Divine Mother really wanted us to expand our reach. And one of the very significant things about that Joy Tour is that a great many people who became very important to Ananda, really key leaders and members, Mary and Tim Kretzmann, Latika came from that, Latika and Stan. David Praver came from that, Bill Cicero, Naidruva. Those are the ones that just immediately come to mind. He just went from city to city, and in pretty much every city he visited, somebody who became very central to Ananda's future was drawn to Ananda. And he just went out to find his people. And what all of those people contributed in terms of the strength and the success and even the financial solidity of Ananda. So it wasn't like the tour itself made money, but the tour itself generated so much magnetism, and that magnetism brought so much energy to Ananda that the future of Ananda was, to a very large extent, defined by Swami's travels. I mean, this is how inspiration would come to him. He would just feel that this was what he was supposed to do. And he could sense what it was and why. But it was, for some people, it was always a challenge to really begin to embrace and understand what Swami was trying to create. And of course, for the people who went along on the tours, they were life-changing experiences, as you can imagine. So, but by August, Swami was just done. He spent 3 years writing The Path. He went around the world, and then he went on that long seclusion. Now he'd been on this long tour. Then he was teaching all these classes and making all these recordings. And he went to Hawaii by himself, which was unusual because usually he took company with him. And he essentially said he wasn't sure if he was coming back. He didn't make that as a big announcement, but he went without a return ticket. And he just needed to get away. And this is one of the very helpful things about really following Swami's life. It's not like he just strode effortlessly through all of this. He had intensely human experiences, and he had his moments of extreme challenge. And what he demonstrated for us is not what a life looks like without that, but what a life looked like with those challenges and how do you resolve it. So he went to Hawaii, and he basically said for 11 and a half years, he had been solely responsible for the financial success of Ananda. And he was constantly having to work with it and, fight against people's misunderstandings the phrase he would use is, I'm not so much tired as tired of. I'm just tired of. So he went to Hawaii, and he went into seclusion, essentially, because he was there by himself, and just prayed. What do you want from me, Master? And there was a little bit of a part of it, which is he'd had that long seclusion in India, and he felt very, very uplifted and changed by it. But Swamiji was never allowed by Master, to have deep samadhis when he would meditate. It just didn't come to him. And so he prayed to Master, what should I do? And the way I wrote it in the book, which was the way Swami expressed it to us, was he said he realized maybe some people can serve Master through their deep meditation, but Swami said, my offering to my Guru is my creative service. Swami says, my gift is creativity. And he said Master had praised him often for the creative way he served. Swamiji just didn't sort of do things as they were always done, but especially once he separated from SRF, but even when he was there, when Master was there, Swamiji wrote up stories of Mukunda. It's like Master had been telling these stories of his boyhood, so Swami turned them into a book. These were just like, nobody told him to do that. It just came to him from the divine to do it in many of the ceremonies and the services and so on that became traditional in SRF. Swami said he just created them. The birthday celebrations, the Mahasamadhi celebrations. He knew what to do. And then afterwards, of course, he wrote all the music and he wrote all the books. And he said every time he thought of leaving Ananda, he said he felt no inspiration. Every time he thought of coming back, he felt Divine Mother's blessing. And then he also resolved within himself that, this was simply his life, this level of constant interaction and constant busyness. So he returned, okay? But he came back and he challenged us to take more financial responsibility. And he called a meeting of the whole community and he said to us, among other things, I have been carrying this community for all these years and everyone needs to step into this more. It's not that people weren't, but more was required. And he set us the challenge. He said, let's raise our net income for all of our Ananda enterprises to $1 million a year, which was a very large amount of money. I mean, just to give you an idea of money at that time, a couple of years earlier when we'd had a communities conference, we'd had 100 people come like that. I found the brochure for it. The conference cost $18 for the weekend, and you could reserve your place by sending a $7 deposit. $7 is like going to Starbucks now and getting a cup of coffee. You could reserve your place with a $7 deposit. It's like, really? But that was 1974 or something like that. So $1 million a year of net income for Ananda was just a very substantial amount of money. But it was also, he was trying to make us more adult, more responsible in what we were doing. So Swami set out again, and in September, the end of September to the end of November, and traveled all across the country one more time, visiting the cities that had been most responsive, and then adding a few cities in Canada. By the time he finished the second tour, he'd traveled 25,000 miles. He'd spoken to about 10,000 people. He'd visited 80 different cities in the combination of both tours, which was about 5 months of travel. And he'd spoken on the same topic, the practice of joy, 200 times, which was really incredible. Maitri, who was on the tour with him, said every time Swami would speak, she would open a notebook, and she said every time he spoke, she would write down things he'd never said before. And then Swami sort of talked to us about how completely in the moment he would always be when he would speak. He said it's common for a public speaker to think, oh, well, that joke went over really well, I'll tell it the next time. Swami would never do that. He said as soon as he finished a talk, he would just wipe it out of his mind, Just as much as possible, forget everything he said, forget that it ever happened, so that he's in the next city, in the next place, and he's standing there. This is a moment that's never happened before. Everything that's happened to Swami has made him different. It's a totally new audience in a totally new city. It has to be a totally fresh and new talk. And Swami said every time, 200 times, he was always flooded with new ideas, new perspectives, new understanding. He did decide, however, that joy was not a very good topic. He said, because people don't understand it. They don't really know what it is. They have to have more experience of the inner life before they can appreciate how central joy is to everything, especially the practice of joy. But it took 200 lectures in 80 cities before Swami decided that. He also, in the context of what I was saying before about how he was always so reluctant to put himself forward, he organized both of those tours as Ananda tours, even though his picture was on the front, and we naturally advertised him and Swami, a master, together. He said he presented Ananda slideshow, the Gandharvas. He said, in fact, often he wouldn't even speak until after the intermission. But he said people didn't like that. He said people came to see him. And he realized that any future tours he would do, he would have to accept the fact that he was really who they were coming to see. And it wasn't fair to them to hold that back. But he said, they'll come for a teacher, but they will get a teaching, which was a very good way to put it. He said, they may think they're coming just for one individual, he said, but what they will receive it will never be a personality cult. That's how Swami put it. He was very, very conscious of how all of these elements would unfold. And as I was explaining to you, he exercised, and he continued to exercise it for most of his life. He just refused to assert himself. If adulation and attention came to him, he would accept it reluctantly. Like reluctantly, he had to accept the fact that this tour was not organized to serve people, because what people related to was him. And if he was really trying to awaken them to their own potential, he had to think in terms of what would work. He couldn't afford to think only in terms of his personal preference. So when he came back at the end of November, the very end of November, and he just immediately went into seclusion. And he came out a little bit for one thing or another, but he had been so completely involved. He had the motorhome to himself, to sleep, but it was also where people cooked, and he was constantly with people, and he just needed to rest and recharge. And he wasn't even sure that he was going to come out for our Christmas celebration, but on the 23rd of December, which was the Christmas meditation, he came and led the meditation. And we had 200 people in the temple for that meditation, which was quite a lot of people. I think the picture I may have showed last week was probably from this year. Some pictures are slightly misnamed, and we were shoulder to shoulder. And it was so deep, it was late in the afternoon before we even took a break. It was so solemn and absolutely so wonderful. Swami also, while he was in seclusion, his book about art, I think this is now the second iteration, or third or fourth, in fact. He wrote it as a college essay. He wrote it when he was at his parents' house after he was expelled from SRF. He wrote it as the foreword to a book called Tales for the Journey, which was published earlier. Now he wrote it for the fourth time. He actually wrote it 7 times, trying to say what he felt about art. And this was the little booklet that he published. And so at Christmas time, he gave us all autographed copies of this little booklet, Meaning in the Arts. It finally became Art as a Hidden Message, which is a book, which will appear much later in the story. But this was our Christmas present this year. So Now, let's look at some pictures, and then we'll listen to Swami play the sonata for us. So, we're just going to look at people and places and a few holidays. These are the monks. The monks always walked around in yellow pajamas. High fashion for Ananda. Monks energizing together. Devarshi, Nitai, Keshava in the front, Agni and Narada in the back. Next picture. This is Dayanand, Nitai, Prakash, Devarshi, and in the far back is Ram. Who knows where, but just somebody had a camera out. Okay. This was the gardening crew sitting down for lunch. That shed that they're sitting in, it was the distribution room for the vegetables. That's where they would gather the harvest and distribute it. So we always called it the distro. That was just the name of it. I think now the market has extended back into these buildings. Maybe some of them have been torn down, but I think some of them where the kitchen is for the market. So it's Devarshi, the other's Vimala Rogers on the far left. Okay, next picture. This is just a beautiful picture of what our farm looked like, and you can see the farmers down there dealing with the compost. It's just from up on a hill somewhere looking down on the farmland. It's a much more attractive picture than some of them that we see. Next picture. And just again out in the hay, the white building there is still standing in his master's market. They were just gathering hay for the compost probably. Next picture. This was one of the rebuilt houses. This was a family with several children, and so they built this double dome with a little hallway in between, or the room in between. Children, I think, lived in one side, and parents lived in the other, I'm not sure. So this was an attempt. We believed that the domes would be quicker and less expensive to build. I have no idea if that was really true, but we did it. So Jyotish put up a dome, and this family put up a double dome, so it would be bigger for them. Next picture. This was the house that Durga and Vidura rebuilt. Last time I showed it in process. This is it finished. Santoshi has lived in this house for many years now. And it's called Friendship House, I believe is what they call it. Next picture. This is the inside of our retreat temple. A Sunday service, that's Lakshman Simpson who's playing. This is just, we had a few chairs and a few benches, but they were always to the back. Almost everyone, in one form or another, sat on the floor. We were just very Indian in the way we did it. Next pictures. This is the retreat temple from the outside. It's not the one we have now. The first one burned in the summer of 1971. This one collapsed sometime in the 90s, I think, or maybe after 2000 it collapsed. It fell on Dambara in a snowstorm, which was a great adventure in itself. I think if you look up somewhere, temple collapsing, Dambara in his inimitable fashion wrote beautifully about it. And he was playing the harmonium when it collapsed, and a number of people asked him, what chant were you playing? And by a lot of unusual circumstances, he was a person of regular habits, Dambara is, and he always sat in the same place in the temple, but not that day. He sat in a different place. And because of where he was sitting, he was not hurt. But if he had been sitting where he usually sat, he might have been very severely injured. So this building fell down, and then subsequently the one we have now is the third iteration at the meditation retreat. Going right along. This is just the porch of the common dome, just serving food. And I take all this for granted. Like we just sat on the porch. We didn't have chairs even. We didn't have tables. Everything was very, very casually done. That's seva, serving. Bharat is seated in white behind. And I think that's Mukti. Mukti's the composer of the O Master song. So people are beginning to show up. Bharat's with us now. Turn the picture. This was Sadhana Devi, Devi and Saraswati, who were all married women with children. And so they were giving a class on family life because we were finally developing family life. At the beginning, the community was almost entirely monastic, but now we were actually getting a very strong core group of families, so they were talking about what their experiences were. Moving. just another group for whatever reason. Nitai, Savitri, Seva, Puru, so on. These are like, as you know now, even now, these are the core pioneer leaders, now turning our responsibilities over to the next generation. But this was when we were starting. Next picture. This is a house built at the seclusion retreat. It now, I'm not sure exactly which one it is, it's now a cabin for guests, and I'm sure it has a name, and some of you may recognize it. But at the time it was built, it was an individual, and I don't know which individual built it to just be their own home there. We were able to build without much regard for regulations, so we could just build the way we felt to build things. It's quite lovely. Next picture. This is Haridas taking Swamiji's role doing the fire ceremony on a Sunday morning. And the next picture is Nitai playing the same role but with a larger crew. This is why when we do the fire ceremony on Sunday mornings now in our temples, I'm always telling people, you don't have to stand up. Swami used to sit and we all used to sit. I often sit myself. I feel like I can concentrate better. It's just easier to go deep into it when you're not having to, your body can relax more, at least I find it so. So it was always done. Whenever you were, especially when Swami was there, we all had rice in our hands and there was just this fire pit and you could throw the rice into the fire pit. And when Swami was there, did you want your karma to go into the fire or did you want it to land on Swami's shoulders? And you would watch because the rice would go all over the person who was sitting there because it's not a fine, you can't really refine it that way. But when your karma just went onto Swami's shoulders, you weren't as worried about it. It was nice to have it go into the fire, but it was okay if it landed on him instead. Next picture. This is one of the singing groups, Maitri, and David Praver has now shown up. That's him on the right listening to the singers. Jeannie's in that group. You don't have to see. You can go on. You can move. This was spiritual boot camp. This was the apprentice program that Prakash was running. So this would be at sunrise. There the sun was just coming up, which is very early in the morning. He had them, they worked really hard. Just recently, like today or yesterday, Savitri published, I saw a blog that Savitri had published about, and she talked about being in that spiritual boot camp and the day she just hitchhiked to town to get away from it. She just had to take a day off. And her talk was about that. And there was our bells where we had these propane tanks that were like 4 feet high, these propane tanks. And when they were empty, you cut out the bottom and then they made wonderful bells. And you had a big hammer that you would, padded hammer, and we used them all over the community. They had a very nice sound and they really carried. And in the middle of the meadow, there was one of those bells like that. And Prakash would vary sometimes, well, the year that it was really strict, like that bell would ring at 4:30, I think, or 5 at the very latest. And one day the whole apprentice group just rebelled, and they wrapped a blanket around the bell, and they wrapped all the duct tape around it, and one of them slept up there. So that when Prakash came out at 4 in the morning, it was impossible to ring the bell because it was guarded by his rebellious minions. So he went from boot camp to what he called the summer of love. And they would switch it back and forth. But nonetheless, there we were outside. Many of the people, almost everyone who came to Ananda during these years came through the apprentice program. That was just how you joined, was you were an apprentice for a while. Next picture. This is the publications building. The balcony out front, I think this has subsequently been removed, but we were 20 feet off the ground here, but we would go out at noontime and have our noon meditation. You can just barely see Shivani, Jyotish, Uma, Asha, Durgadas is the man's name, then Anandi, Ganesha, Agni, way at the end, the black hair is Rambhakta. Rambhakta was always working in publications, writing, photography, everything that he still does. Those were great meditations. Our whole crew would just come out there every day at noon, and then we'd have our lunch after that. Next picture. Ganesha took over the recording business. This is just, now we have just a few individual pictures. Let's take the next. He became the engineer. This is again Ram Bhakta in those days. And next. And this is Devi now with her little boy, who must be about 2 at this point. And the next picture is of Jyotish and Devi. It's a very interesting picture, isn't it? Their eyes are so marvelous, both of them. That's a really, especially of Jyotish, that's really a handsome picture of him. Well, moving on to the next. Wow. Kabir with his school classroom. They were obviously having some outdoor lesson. This was his, these were his kids. Not his biological children, but his school children. So you can see how much fun we had there. Next picture. This was the school staff. Kabir, Nitai, Ram, Saraswati, and Mary Kretzmann. And the 2 other souls, Beatrice and Louis, very nice people, but they didn't end up staying with us. So that was our Living Wisdom School staff at Ananda Village. Next picture. This was the health food store, Earth Song, and Shraddha is the woman there. She's the one who started this. This was in response to Swami saying, we need to earn money. We need to start businesses. We need to expand our thinking. You know, we can't have businesses just way out here in the wilderness. We have to go into Nevada City and start opening businesses. So we opened Earth Song and eventually Mountain Song also. And Shraddha was the moving energy behind this. It was a very nice health food store and cafe, which we ran for many years, 20, 25 years maybe after that. Next picture. And then just a sweet one of Shivani and Arjuna. And next. This was us. We were on a trip to Carmel. That shirt that Swami's wearing with the sort of night scene of the pine trees, that's actually still hanging in his closet. At least it was the last time I was there, in his apartment at Crystal Hermitage. It was so quintessential Kriyananda that I think no one's quite known what to do with it. He, as I said, he didn't have a lot of clothes, but the ones he had, he wore often, and this was a favorite shirt that he wore. Kalyani and Seva and me. I could have used a few lessons in fashion, which later in my life I received. Okay, moving to the next. This is Padma and Seva just on the beach there on that same trip to Carmel. Okay, next. Everybody enjoying volleyball. Volleyball is the great community sport, and we're just out. They've set up more formally, but this is just, we would just put up the net and people would just play in the afternoons. Okay, now this is the picture I expected to see last time. This was India Fair in 1978. Kalyani organized it, and she contacted a nightclub either in Reno or Las Vegas, I think it was Reno, where they actually had live elephants. And she persuaded those people to bring their live elephants to our India Fair. And so there they are. Their trainer was somewhere nearby, but the elephants just walked right through the meadow, actually headed for the lake. Let's see the next picture. Here is their keeper, and he was showing, doing the kinds of things that they did in the nightclub act. The next picture, the children just walked right up to the elephants, and I don't have a picture of it, but what happened was the trainer took the elephants down to the lake, to Lotus Lake, which is there now where the outdoor amphitheater is. There was no amphitheater. The elephants just went in the water and started swimming. We heard later that it had been like decades. The elephants lived inside for this nightclub. And now they had been brought up to Ananda. They wandered in the meadow, and then they went swimming. And the kids jumped on the elephants' backs and used them as a diving platform. They swam with the elephants. I vaguely remember somebody wondering if this was safe. But we didn't worry about things very much in those years. We just expected that everything would work out just right. So it was a very memorable India fair because of the live elephants. So next picture. Now we're at Christmas. This was our, this is Lakshmi's daughter on the far right, and Jaya and Sadhana Devi's daughter in the center. The other children have, well, this is Luke Gosink. His mother, Jayanti, lives in the Sacramento community. This was just a Christmas Eve celebration or Christmas Day celebration. Next picture. We were cooking either the banquet or we were cooking the other meals so that the staff could cook the banquet. I don't know who the man is. That's me, and Kirtani is the two pictures, the two faces you can see, cooking in the kitchen. Next picture. These were the nuns. I found in some notes, we got up, we got to the retreat at 6 in the morning, because whatever cooking we had to do, we had to get it all done early. And I was writing just about how wonderfully fun. This is basically the nuns, and Uma was a very good cook, very skilled in the kitchen. Most of the nuns were not that skilled in the kitchen, but she was, and I was, and between the two of us, they were all very willing and extremely adept at learning, and we worked together. It was absolutely blissful. Next. In those years, I think it was Christmas Eve, for a while the monks would put on a skit. Their skits got mixed reviews, and after a while we managed to wrest the skits away from them, or we managed to kill the whole idea of skits, but this was one of them, 1978. This is Bharat dressed as Santa Claus, you can't tell, and Nitai there is one of his elves. Prahlad is on the far right, Santosh O'Hara on the far left. There's another picture here. This has to do, next picture, has to do with whether you were naughty or nice, because you see that's a karmatron. I think the plot of the skit was a little thin, but the enthusiasm was really high. So this is how we spent Christmas Eve. In the red fez there, that's actually Ananta peeking over the top, helping to carry Bharat in whatever it was he was doing. Okay, next picture. We also, of course, here's the singers. We were, pouring our hearts out to God and Guru. Uma's in the plaid dress there. Moving to the next picture. This was actually Swamiji was singing Looking for a Friend. And Kalyani had a beautiful soprano and Lakshman had a beautiful tenor. Lakshman could sing a wide range. And so the three of them were singing Looking for a Friend. And of course it was astral. That's all. There's just no other word for it. You can see on Lakshman's face how much it moves him to listen to Swami sing. So the next picture. This was the monks and the nuns. We went over to Swami's house on Christmas Day morning. It became a tradition, and we would cook blintzes. I don't know why, but I started that somewhere, and so every year we'd cook blintzes, and Swami would have a Christmas morning party with the monks and the nuns. I don't know if this was Christmas or not, but that would be what we would have looked like. Seva, Asha, Nandi, Parvati, that woman is Cassandra, Vairagi, Kalyani, Uma, Maria, McSweeney, Shankari, and then back among the men, you see Keshava, Prakash, Devarshi, the same faces, but you can see that each year, a few more come. Bharat is there now, Nitai. Anyway, these were glorious days. Okay, next picture. And then this was our community picture, which we would take at Spiritual Renew Week. I have a little something here. Let me just find it. Yes, here it is. And we'd print it out and send it out as a Christmas card. That sort of became a tradition that we followed. And on the back of it, Swami wrote a very sweet and very inspiring Christmas letter, which I quote from in the book. just talking about what's really important to all of us. Whenever we would dress up, the girls we'd always put on saris. That was like for us our formal wear. So we would pose for the picture. We're getting to the point where it's about half and half. About half the people who are in these pictures have remained with Ananda for the rest of their lives, which is a pretty high percentage considering how long ago it was. Next picture. And this is the chapter photo for 1978, because of all the traveling and so on that Swami did, and playing the guitar and so on. This was the statement picture for that year. So now, while this picture is in front of us, he's playing the guitar, but what we're going to listen to is the recording of Swami himself playing his piano sonata. This is the 3-movement sonata that he wrote for his mother, that he called the Divine Romance. And there's no words for the first movement because he didn't write them till later. I don't know if there'll be a voice at the very end, but we'll see. It's 11 minutes, just so you know. And so now we'll just listen to that, and that will be the end of our evening.